Hello everyone. Tonight we begin with a story about why being a medieval doctor was such a dangerous job. A world of bloodletting, mysterious potions, and desperate patients who often feared their healers as much as their illnesses. Medicine in those days was as much guesswork as faith. Before we begin today's video, I could really use your help. We've noticed the channel's reach has dipped a little, and one of the best ways you can support us is by subscribing. It's quick, completely free, and it helps us carry on bringing you new and fascinating stories. Your support truly means the world to us, and together we can keep this channel growing. Thank you ever so much. Now, let's get on with today's story. And write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see who joins us from different corners of the world. Now, dim the lights, perhaps turn on a quiet fan for a soft background hum, and let's step into the smoky chambers and candlelit surgeries of the medieval world. I'm old now, and my hands shake when I lift the cup to my lips. These same hands once held a blade steady enough to pierce the vein of an archbishop, once mixed remedies in the depth of plague summers, once touched the foreheads of children whose breath grew shallow in the night. The trembling began years ago, though whether from age or from memory I cannot say. Perhaps there is no difference. They call me Master Physician still, though I have not practiced in 15 years. The title follows me through the marketplace like a shadow, and people step aside when they see me coming. Some make the sign of the cross. Others simply look away. I do not blame them. I have seen things no man should see, and my face has learned to wear that knowledge like a second skin. I was born in the year of our Lord, 1328, in a village whose name no longer matters. My father worked leather, and my mother kept bees. I was the youngest of 4 sons, and therefore the one who could be spared. When the Franciscan brothers came through our parish seeking a boy to train in letters, my father paid them in hides and honey, and I went. I was 9 years old. The monastery was 3 days' walk from home, and I never returned. Not because I was forbidden, but because the boy who left that village was not the man who might have gone back. The cloister became my world. Cold stone floors, the smell of beeswax and old parchment, the sound of Latin prayers rolling through halls that had stood for 300 years. I learned to read first in our own tongue, then in Latin, then in fragments of Greek and Arabic that the older brothers kept in locked chests, books that had travelled from Toledo and Salerno, from places where learning had not yet been called heresy. Brother Anselm was the infirmarian, the keeper of the monastery's small hospital. He was a thin man with a face like carved wood and hands that never stopped moving. He taught me the names of herbs before I understood what they were for. Feverfew for headaches, wormwood for worms, comfrey for broken bones, though how a plant could mend what God had broken I did not understand. He made me memorize the humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. He taught me that all illness came from imbalance, that the body was a vessel that could tip too far in any direction, and that our task was to restore equilibrium through bleeding, purging, or the careful application of heat and cold. I believed him absolutely. I was 14 when I first saw a man whose breath had left the room. He was a traveller who had collapsed at our gates during a winter storm. Brother Anselm and I carried him to the infirmary, laid him on a straw pallet near the fire, covered him with every blanket we could find. His skin was grey, his lips blue. Brother Anselm felt for the pulse at his neck, then at his wrist, then placed his ear against the man's chest. Nothing. We prayed over him for an hour, and then we wrapped him in linen and carried him to the chapel. I'd seen the departed before, of course. My grandmother when I was 6, a neighbour's infant, a man who drowned in the millstream. But this was different. This was a man who had been alive when we touched him, whose warmth had still clung to his clothes, and who had slipped away while we knelt beside him. I felt as though I had been given something to hold and had let it fall. Brother Anselm saw my face. He put his hand on my shoulder and said, "You will see many more before you are done. Learn to bear it, or choose another path." I chose to bear it. By 16 I was assisting Brother Anselm with everything, setting broken limbs, lancing boils, preparing poultices of ground mustard seed and goose grease for inflammation. I learned to bleed patients using a small brass lancet, cutting the vein in the crook of the arm and letting the dark red flow into a bowl until Brother Anselm judged it sufficient. too little, and the humours remained unbalanced. Too much, and the patient grew weak and pale. There was an art to it, a feeling in the wrist, a sense of when to press the cloth against the wound and bind it tight. I learned to read urine like a text. We kept a chart on the infirmary wall showing 20 different shades, from clear as spring water to dark as ale, each one indicating a different disorder of the kidneys or liver or spleen. Patients would bring us samples in small clay bottles, and we would hold them up to the light, sometimes tasting a drop on the tongue to detect sweetness or bitterness. The body spoke through its waters, Brother Anselm said, and we had only to learn the language. I learned to prepare remedies from the monastery garden, tinctures of poppy for pain, distillations of rose water and lavender for fevers, thick pastes of ground willow bark that eased aching joints. I learned which plants could heal and which could harm, and that sometimes there was no difference save the measure. Foxglove for a failing heart, but 2 drops too many and the heart would stop entirely. Henbane for sleep, but a spoonful, and the sleep would have no waking. Would you have trusted such knowledge in the hands of a boy barely old enough to shave? Would you have let him open your veins, knowing he had done it only a dozen times before? They did, because there was no one else. In the year 1346, I was 18 years old, and the world changed. The wasting came from the east, they said, from the lands of silk and spices, from ships that docked in Genoa and Marseille carrying more than cloth and pepper. It had 100 names. The pestilence, the great mortality, the judgment of God. We called it the Visitation, as though it were a guest we had not invited but could not refuse. It reached our monastery in late summer. Brother Thomas was the first. He complained of headache and fever, and Brother Anselm sent him to bed with a tea of willow bark and feverfew. By evening he was vomiting, and by midnight he was burning with a heat that no compress could cool. I sat beside him through the night, changing the cloths on his forehead, whispering prayers I barely remembered. Just before dawn he began to shiver violently despite the fire we had built up beside his bed, and I piled every blanket in the infirmary upon him. It made no difference. By noon the next day, dark stains had appeared beneath his arms and in his groin, swellings the size of apples that turned his skin tight and shining. He screamed when we touched them. Brother Anselm lanced one, hoping to release the poison, and what emerged was thick and foul-smelling, a mixture of matter and the heavy trace that only rain could cleanse. Brother Thomas died that night, crying for his mother in a voice that sounded nothing like his own. 3 more brothers fell ill within the week. We did everything we knew. We bled them to reduce the fever. We applied poultices of lily root and onion to draw out the poison. We burned juniper and rosemary to purify the air. We prayed without ceasing. The chapel bells rang every hour, calling us to intercession, and the abbot ordered a relic of St. Sebastian brought from the treasury and placed in the infirmary, for Sebastian had survived arrows and surely could protect against this invisible assault. Nothing worked. By the end of the month, 12 brothers had made their quiet departure, and the monastery felt like a tomb with living men still walking its corridors. The abbot ordered the gates closed. No travellers were to be admitted, no villagers seeking alms or healing. We were to seal ourselves away and pray that God's wrath would pass over us, as the angel had passed over Egypt. But the wasting cared nothing for walls or prayers. Brother Anselm fell ill on the feast of St. Michael. I found him in the garden at dawn, leaning against the wall, his face grey and wet with perspiration. He looked at me and said, "It has come for me, then." I helped him to his cell and made him as comfortable as I could. He refused to go to the infirmary, saying he would not take a bed from someone who might yet recover. I think he knew what I could not yet admit, that no one recovered. I tended him for 3 days. I brought him water when he could drink, held the basin when he could not keep anything down, changed his linen when the fever broke in sheets of sweat that soaked through to the straw mattress beneath. The swellings appeared on the 2nd day, hard lumps beneath his jaw and in his groin. His skin turned the colour of old bruises, purple and yellow and black. On the 3rd night he took my hand and said, "You must not stay here. When I am gone, leave this place. Go to a city where they have physicians trained at the universities. Learn what I could not teach you. And remember, we are only men. We do what we can, and it is never enough." and we must do it anyway. He died just before dawn, while I knelt beside his bed reciting the prayers for the dying. His hand grew cold in mine, and I felt the moment when the spirit left, a change in the air like the stillness before a storm. I was 19 years old, and I had lost the only teacher I would ever have. The monastery buried 37 brothers that autumn. Of the original community of 60, only 23 survived to see the winter. I was among them, though I do not know why. I touched the sick, breathed the same air, slept in rooms where men died gasping for breath. Perhaps I had been touched by grace. Perhaps I had simply been lucky. Perhaps there is no difference. When the snows came and the wasting finally retreated, the abbot summoned me to his chambers. He was an old man, made older by grief, and he looked at me with eyes that had seen too much. "You have a gift," he said. "You did not fall ill, though you nursed the sick without rest. God has preserved you for a purpose." I did not feel preserved. I felt hollow, scraped clean by loss. "Brother Anselm told me you should continue your studies," the abbot said. "There is a physician in Oxford, a master of the medical faculty, who is a friend to our order. I will write to him. You will go there when the roads are passable, and you will learn what the universities teach, and then you will return and serve as our infirmarian." I never returned. I left the monastery in early spring of 1347, carrying a letter of introduction, a small purse of silver coins, and a leather satchel containing everything I owned: 2 spare shirts, a copy of the Psalms, a notebook in which I had recorded every remedy Brother Anselm had taught me, and the brass lancet he had used for bleeding. It was all I had of him. The journey to Oxford took 2 weeks. I walked through a landscape that seemed to have been emptied of people. Villages stood abandoned, doors hanging open, gardens gone to weed. In one town I saw a church with the door barred from outside, and when I pressed my ear to the wood, I heard nothing. Later, I learned that the living had sometimes locked the sick inside to prevent the wasting from spreading, and then fled, leaving them to their quiet departure in darkness. The roads were dangerous. There were fewer travellers, which meant fewer eyes to deter thieves, and I kept my purse hidden beneath my shirt and slept in hedgerows rather than inns. Once, I came upon a group of men digging a great pit beside the road, and when I asked what they were doing, one of them laughed bitterly and gestured to a cart piled high with linen-wrapped bundles. I did not ask again. Oxford was a city of stone and learning, crowded and loud after the silence of the monastery. The university occupied a dozen buildings scattered throughout the town, and students in scholars' robes hurried through narrow streets carrying armloads of books. I found the physician the abbot had written to, a Master Gilbert who lectured on Galen and Hippocrates and maintained a small practice treating the town's wealthier inhabitants. He read the abbot's letter, looked me up and down and said, "Can you read Latin?" "Yes, master." "Greek?" "A little." "Arabic?" "No, master," he grunted. "You will learn. The best medical texts are in Arabic. Avicenna, Rhazes, Averroes. The Saracens preserved what Rome forgot." He handed the letter back to me. "You will attend lectures on the humours, on fevers, on surgery, and materia medica. You will assist me in my practice. You will copy texts. You will grind herbs and prepare remedies. You will empty chamber pots and wash linens. If you prove diligent, I will sponsor your examination for the license to practice. If you prove lazy or stupid, I will send you back to your monastery. Do you understand?" "Yes, master." "Good. You may sleep in the attic above my workroom. There is a pallet and a blanket. Lectures begin at dawn." I studied in Oxford for 3 years. I learned the classical texts: Hippocrates' treatises on airs, waters and places, Galen's theories of the humours and the pulse, Avicenna's canon of medicine, a vast encyclopedia of everything the Islamic world knew about healing. I learned that illness arose from imbalances in the 4 humours, and that treatment required adjusting these through diet, exercise, bleeding, purging, and the administration of medicines classified as hot, cold, wet, or dry. I learned to diagnose by examining the pulse, of which there were dozens of varieties: strong, weak, rapid, slow, thready, bounding, intermittent. I learned to read the face for signs of approaching dissolution: the pinched nose, the hollow temples, the glassy eyes. I learned the critical days of fever, when the illness would either break or claim its victim. The 3rd day, the 7th, the 14th, I learned that the stars influenced health, that Saturn brought melancholy and cold diseases, that Mars brought fevers and inflammation, that the moon governed the brain and all fluid humours. A wise physician consulted the heavens before bleeding or purging, choosing times when the celestial influences were favourable. I learned anatomy from books, not bodies. The Church frowned upon dissection, considering it a desecration of the temple of the soul. What we knew of the body's interior came from Galen, who had dissected animals and assumed men were built the same. We memorized the names of organs, the paths of vessels, the structure of bones, but we had never seen them with our own eyes. Would you have trusted a physician who had never looked inside a human body? Would you have believed him when he told you where your kidneys sat, or how your heart was shaped? They did, because authority mattered more than observation. Master Gilbert's practice was varied. We treated wealthy merchants for gout and indigestion, prescribed syrups for their wives' headaches, examined their children for signs of worms or rickets. We bled and purged according to the season and the phase of the moon. We prepared complex remedies. Theriac, a mixture of dozens of ingredients including viper's flesh, thought to be a universal antidote to poison. Mithridate, another ancient compound against venom and plague. Electuaries of honey and spices to restore warmth to cold stomachs. We also treated the poor, though not for payment. Master Gilbert maintained a public dispensary 2 mornings each week, where the desperate and destitute could seek advice. They came with every manner of affliction, suppurating wounds, tumours, consumptions that left them thin and coughing, fevers that would not break, children whose bellies swelled with hunger or disease. We did what we could, which was often very little. I remember a woman who brought her daughter, a girl of perhaps 6 years, who had not spoken in months. The child's eyes were distant, unfocused, and she did not respond when we spoke to her or touched her hand. Master Gilbert examined her carefully, feeling her pulse, looking at her tongue, studying the shape of her skull. Finally, he pronounced it a coldness of the brain, an excess of phlegm that dulled the senses. He prescribed warming herbs and advised the mother to keep the child near the fire and feed her hot broths. The woman had tears in her eyes. "Will she speak again, Master?" Master Gilbert hesitated. "If God wills it." They left, and I never saw them again. I do not know if the child recovered. I do not know if our remedy helped or harmed or did nothing at all. This is the truth of medicine that no text will teach you. We worked in darkness, guessing, hoping, praying, that our learning was not merely elaborate ignorance. In my 3rd year, I was examined by a board of physicians and granted a license to practice. I was 22 years old. Master Gilbert offered me a position as his assistant, but I declined. Oxford felt too comfortable, too distant from the suffering I had witnessed in the monastery. I wanted to go where physicians were scarce, where need was greatest. I went north to the city of York. York in the year 1350 was a city rebuilding itself after the Great Mortality. Whole streets stood empty, workshops without craftsmen, houses without families. But it was also a city of opportunity for a young physician. The old practitioners had died, and the living needed healing. I rented 2 rooms above a baker's shop near the Minster. The lower room became my workroom and dispensary, with shelves for my books and jars of medicines, a table for examinations, and a brazier for heating water and preparing infusions. The upper room was my bedchamber, barely large enough for a bed and a chest for my clothes. The smell of baking bread rose through the floorboards each morning, and I woke to warmth and the sound of the baker's apprentice singing as he kneaded dough. I painted a sign and hung it outside my door, a staff entwined with a serpent, the ancient symbol of healing, and beneath it my name and title in letters large enough to be read from the street. Within a week, patients began to come. They came with fevers and agues, with wounds that would not heal, with pains in the chest and belly, with coughs that brought up matter streaked with the heavy trace that only rain could cleanse. They came with skin eruptions and failing sight, with tremors and weakness, with the 1,000 afflictions that flesh is heir to. I treated them as I had been taught, examining, diagnosing, prescribing. For fevers, I prescribed cooling remedies, lettuce water, barley broths, applications of wet cloths soaked in vinegar. For cold diseases, warming herbs, ginger, cinnamon, pepper mixed with honey. For excess blood, I opened a vein. For excess phlegm, I administered emetics to provoke purging. For melancholy, I suggested music, pleasant company and wine in moderation. Some recovered, some did not. I learned to distinguish between those I could help and those I could only comfort, and that the latter were far more numerous. I remember an old soldier who came to me with a wound in his leg that had festered for months, the flesh around it red and swollen, leaking a thick fluid that stank of rot. He had taken the injury in France, he said, during some petty border skirmish, and had treated it himself with wine and cobwebs. Now the infection had spread upward, and he could not walk without agony. I examined the wound carefully. The flesh was dying, turning black at the edges, and I could see bone through the deepest part. I knew what needed to be done, though the knowledge sat in my stomach like cold lead. The leg must come off, I said. He looked at me with eyes that had seen battle and sudden passings, and fear beyond imagining, and he was afraid. Will I survive it? Perhaps, if the poison has not spread too far, if the bleeding can be stopped, if the wound does not putrefy further. And if you do nothing, you will certainly face your quietest departure within the month. He was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Do it." I'd assisted at amputations in Oxford, but I had never performed one myself. I sent word to a surgeon I knew, a grim-faced man named Thomas, who had trained in the wars and who knew how to work quickly with saw and blade. We scheduled the operation for the following morning, and told the soldier to drink as much strong ale as he could hold. The surgery took place in my workroom, with the soldier laid across my examination table and two of his friends holding him down. Thomas gave him a leather strap to bite, and a draught of poppy mixed with wine to dull the pain. Then he tied a cord tight around the soldier's thigh, cutting off the flow of that heavy trace that only rain could cleanse, and he began to cut. I will not describe it in detail. Sufficient to say that it is one thing to read about the severing of flesh and bone in a medical text, and another to smell it, to hear the saw rasping through the marrow, to see a man thrash against the hands that hold him and scream despite the leather between his teeth. The whole procedure took perhaps 20 minutes, though it felt like hours. Thomas was skilled. He cut through the muscle quickly, tied off the major vessels with silk thread, and sawed through the bone in a few dozen strokes. I held the basin to catch what spilled, and when it was done I helped him cauterize the stump with a hot iron, pressing the smoking metal against the raw flesh, while the soldier had mercifully passed into unconsciousness. We bandaged the wound with linen soaked in wine and oil of roses, and we carried him to my bedchamber, where he could rest under my observation. For 3 days he burned with fever, and I was certain he would not survive. I changed his bandages twice daily, administered cooling drinks, bled him once from the arm to reduce the heat. On the 4th day, the fever broke, and he opened his eyes and asked for water. He lived. Within 2 months he was walking on a wooden leg that a carpenter had fashioned for him, and he returned to his old trade of making saddles. He paid me in leather goods, a fine satchel for carrying my instruments, a belt, a pair of gloves. Every time I wore them I thought of his leg buried in the churchyard, and of how close we had both come to failure. Not all my patients were so fortunate. There was a merchant's wife who came to me pregnant with her 4th child, complaining of pain and bleeding. I examined her as modestly as I could, using touch and questioning rather than direct observation, and I determined that the child was positioned wrongly, lying across rather than head down. I prescribed bed rest, prayer, and a pilgrimage to the shrine of St. Margaret, patron of childbirth if she were able to travel. She went into labour 2 months early, on a winter night when the streets were glazed with ice. Her husband fetched me near midnight, and I came with my bag of instruments and a prayer that I would not be needed, but I was. The child was indeed transverse, and no amount of prayer or pushing could bring it forth. I tried to turn it, reaching inside to shift the tiny body into position, but the space was too narrow, and my hands too large, and the woman was screaming in agony. The midwife who attended looked at me with frightened eyes and said, "You must choose." I knew what she meant. I could try to save the mother by extracting the child in pieces, a terrible procedure that involved hooks and blades, and left the woman torn and traumatized, but alive. Or I could let nature take its course and likely lose them both. I chose to save the mother. It was the worst thing I have ever done, and I have done it more than once. The child had not yet drawn breath, I told myself. The child was not yet a soul in the eyes of the church. The mother had other children who needed her. These were the arguments I made to quiet my conscience as I used my instruments to ensure that only one life would be lost that night instead of two. The woman survived, though she never looked at me again without something like horror in her eyes. Her husband paid me and asked me never to return to their house. I did not protest. Some services cannot be thanked, only endured. Would you have made that choice? Would you have taken one life to preserve another, knowing that the church called it murder? That the family would hate you? That you would lie awake at night wondering if there had been another way? I made it because I was the only one there who could, because someone had to decide, and I was called physician. In the spring of 1352 the wasting returned. It was not as severe as the first outbreak, but it was enough. The city gates were closed, markets suspended, churches opened day and night for continuous prayers. And I, young and foolish and believing I had survived once by some providence, offered my services to the pest house. The pest house was a former monastery outside the city walls, hastily converted to receive the sick so they would not spread contagion within the town. It was a place of desperation and sorrow, rows of straw pallets in draughty halls, the air thick with the smell of smoke and sickness, and the herbs we burned to purify the atmosphere. We wore long robes soaked in vinegar and masks with beaks stuffed with aromatic compounds, rose petals, camphor, myrrh. We looked like carrion birds, ministering to the dying. There were 2 other physicians, an elderly master who had survived the first plague, and a nervous young man fresh from his studies in Paris. There were several surgeons, a dozen monks who served as nurses, and the priest who heard confessions and administered the final rites. We worked in shifts, sleeping in a separate building when we could, though sleep was difficult when you could hear the moaning through the walls. I learned things in that pest house that no university could teach. I learned that the wasting was not one disease, but several, that some patients developed the swellings we called buboes, while others coughed themselves into their final quietude without any visible marks. I learned that the very young and very old died fastest, while those in their prime sometimes fought the fever for days before succumbing. I learned that some patients recovered spontaneously, their buboes draining and their fevers breaking without any intervention from us, while others died despite everything we attempted. Most importantly, I learned that we could do almost nothing to change the outcome. We bled them, but it seemed to make them weaker. We administered theriac and mithridate, but the patients died anyway. We lanced the buboes to drain the poison, but the wounds often putrefied and spread the infection. We prayed, and God seemed not to hear. The elderly physician, Master John, told me one night as we sat exhausted over cups of wine, "I have treated plague for 20 years, and I know nothing more now than I did when I started. Nothing works. Not bloodletting, not purging, not prayer, not pilgrimage. Some live, most pass on, and we cannot predict which. We are here to bear witness, not to heal." "Then why do you continue?" I asked. He looked at me with eyes that had long ago stopped expecting answers. "Because someone must. Because the sick deserve the comfort of knowing they are not abandoned. Because perhaps one day we will understand, and all this suffering will teach us something. And because if we do not try, we are not physicians. We are merely cowards in learned robes." I worked in the pest house for 4 months. In that time, more than 300 patients were brought through its gates. Fewer than 50 left alive. I survived again, though I do not know why. Perhaps the vinegar-soaked robes and aromatic masks helped, or perhaps I had already been touched by the wasting and carried some protection in my flesh. Or perhaps it was simply chance, the same chance that took one man and spared another without reason or justice. When the outbreak finally subsided and the pest house was closed, I returned to my rooms above the baker's shop and found them covered in dust, my books mildewed, my instruments tarnished. I spent a week cleaning and restoring, and then I hung my sign once more and reopened my practice. But I was changed. I'd seen too much to believe any more in the certainty of the medical texts, the elegant theories of humours and temperaments. I had watched those theories fail again and again, watched patients die who should have lived and live who should have expired. I began to doubt everything I had been taught, and so I began to observe. I kept careful notes on every patient, recording their symptoms, the treatments I prescribed, and the outcomes. I began to notice patterns that the books did not mention. I noticed that women who had many children close together often developed a wasting pallor and exhaustion that no remedy could cure, but that rest and good food slowly restored. I noticed that apprentices who worked with lead or mercury often developed tremors and confusion. I noticed that certain remedies seemed to help some conditions more reliably than others. Willow bark for pain and fever, digitalis for certain ailments of the heart, cinchona bark for intermittent fevers. I began to question some of the established practices. Bleeding, for instance, seemed to weaken patients more often than it helped them. I reduced the amount I took, and then I began to skip it altogether for certain conditions. Some patients recovered faster. Master John would have called this heresy, but Master John was gone, taken by a winter ague the year after the plague. I learned to be honest with patients about what I did not know. When they asked if they would recover, I said, "I cannot tell you. I will do everything in my power to help you, but the outcome rests with God." Some found this comforting. Others went to different physicians who promised certainties they could not deliver. I learned that the art of medicine was as much about comfort as cure. A patient who trusted you, who felt heard and cared for, often seemed to fare better than one who felt abandoned, even if the treatments were identical. I learned to sit beside the bed and listen, to place my hand on the shoulder, to speak words of hope even when I felt none. I learned that sometimes the best remedy was time, and that doing nothing was often wiser than doing something harmful. By the time I was 30, I'd earned a reputation in York as a skilled physician, one who was honest about the limits of his knowledge and who did not promise miracles. My practice grew. I treated merchants and craftsmen, nobles passing through the city, monks from the cathedral. I was called to treat the Sheriff of Yorkshire for gout, the Abbot of St. Mary's for a quartan fever, the Dean of the Minster for a painful stone in his bladder. I was also called to treat the poor, though they could not pay. I maintained the tradition Master Gilbert had taught me, keeping certain mornings each week for those who could offer nothing but gratitude. They came with the afflictions of poverty, malnutrition, injuries from dangerous labour, infections from crowded and unsanitary living conditions. I did what I could, which was often simply listening and offering a tonic or a poultice, and a few words of encouragement. There was a beggar woman who came to me regularly with a consumptive cough that grew worse each winter. I could not cure her, but I gave her a syrup of honey and horehound that eased the symptoms, and a spare blanket when the cold grew fierce. She died eventually, of course, but she thanked me each time we met, as though the small comfort I provided was treasure beyond price. Perhaps it was. Who am I to say what matters in the face of suffering? It was in the year 1358 that I first encountered the accusation that would haunt me for the rest of my career. A farmer brought his son to me, a boy of 12 who had fallen from a hayloft and broken his arm. I set the bone carefully, binding it with splints and bandages, and instructed the father on how to care for it. The boy should keep the arm still, I said, elevated when possible, and return in 2 weeks so I could check the healing. They did not return in 2 weeks. They returned in 4, and the boy's arm was bent at an unnatural angle, the bone having healed crookedly. The father was furious. "You did this," he shouted in the middle of my dispensary, while other patients looked on in alarm. "You crippled my son. He'll never work properly again. You're a fraud and a devil." I tried to explain that the boy must have used the arm despite my instructions, that bones needed time to knit properly, that I had set it correctly and the fault lay in not following my directions. But the man would not hear it. He left threatening to report me to the Guild of Physicians, to the church, to anyone who would listen. Nothing came of it legally, but the damage was done. Rumours spread through the city that I was incompetent, that I harmed more than I helped, that patients who came to me left worse than they arrived. My practice declined for months afterwards, until other successes gradually restored my reputation. But I had learned a dangerous truth. The physician lives or dies by reputation, and reputation can be destroyed by a single angry patient, justified or not. We worked miracles, we were praised. We failed, we were devils. There was no middle ground, no acknowledgement that we were merely men doing our best with imperfect knowledge. Would you have continued, knowing that every patient might become an accuser, that every failure might destroy everything you had built? I continued, because I could do nothing else. In 1361 I was called to attend a nobleman, Sir Edmund of Crake, who had fallen ill at his manor some 15 miles from York. I rode out on a cold October morning, my satchel packed with instruments and medicines, uncertain what I would find. The manor was a fortified hall surrounded by farmland and forest, and Sir Edmund was a powerful man in the region, with connections to the crown and the archbishop. His chamberlain met me at the gate and led me to the Lord's bedchamber, a large room warmed by a fire and hung with tapestries. Sir Edmund lay in a curtained bed, his face flushed with fever, his breathing shallow and rapid. I examined him carefully. His pulse was weak and irregular. His tongue was coated and dry. His urine was dark and scanty. He had pain in his side and a cough that brought up thick matter. I diagnosed a pleurisy, an inflammation of the lungs that often proved fatal in men of his age. I prescribed bleeding to reduce the fever, a poultice of linseed and fenugreek to ease the pain, and draughts of barley water with licorice to soothe the cough. I also suggested prayer and the intercession of saints, for I knew that human remedy would not be enough. Sir Edmund's wife, Lady Margaret, watched me with eyes that expected certainty. "Will he recover, Master Physician?" I chose my words carefully. "He is gravely ill, my lady. I will do everything within my power, but much depends on his own strength and the will of God." She did not like this answer, but she accepted it. I was installed in a chamber near the Lord's room and attended him for the next week. I bled him twice, changed his poultices morning and evening, administered my draughts according to a strict schedule. The fever persisted. The cough worsened. On the 5th day, I noticed the heavy trace that only rain could cleanse in what he coughed up, and I knew then that his time was growing short. Sir Edmund knew it too. On the 6th night, he called me to his bedside when we were alone, and spoke in a hoarse whisper. "I am going to face my quiet departure, am I not?" I could have lied, offered false hope, but he deserved truth. "Yes, my lord, I believe so." He nodded slowly. "Then I thank you for your honesty. Most physicians would have promised recovery until the very end, taking my gold and leaving my soul unprepared." He paused, struggling for breath. "There is something I must tell you. My son, my heir, is to be married next spring to the daughter of the Earl of Northumberland. Everything depends on this alliance. When I am gone, you must tell my wife and my steward that I died of natural causes, of an age that could not be prevented. Do you understand?" "Yes, my lord. If there is any suspicion, any whisper that I was poisoned or cursed, the marriage will be broken and my house will fall into ruin. You must protect my family's name." I understood what he was asking. He wanted me to shield him from the accusations that often followed noble passings, the suspicions of poison or witchcraft or political murder. He was asking me to use my authority as physician to certify that his passing was God's will. Nothing more. I gave him my word. He died 2 days later, with his wife and children at his bedside, and the priest administering the final rites. I certified that he had succumbed to a pleurisy complicated by fever, that everything possible had been done, that no earthly remedy could have saved him. The family accepted this, paid me generously, and sent me back to York with their gratitude. But I carried away more than gold. I carried the knowledge that I had become something more than a healer. I had become a keeper of secrets, a guardian of reputations, someone whose word could protect or destroy. It was a burden I had not asked for, but one that came with the title of physician. Over the years I would be asked many times to bend truth for the sake of a family's honour, to declare natural what might have been unnatural, to remain silent about things I'd seen or suspected. Sometimes I agreed, sometimes I refused. I do not know if I chose rightly. I know only that the practice of medicine drew me into the affairs of powerful people, and that power is always dangerous to those who serve it. In the year 1368, I was 40 years old, and I received a summons that would change my life. The Archbishop of York requested my presence at his palace. It was not an invitation one refused. I put on my finest robes, took up my medical bag, and presented myself at the gates of Bishopthorpe Palace on a grey morning in March. His Grace was an imposing man, tall and stern, with eyes that seemed to see through flesh into the soul beneath. He received me in his private chambers, dismissed his attendants, and got directly to the matter at hand. "Master Physician, I have heard much about your skill and discretion. I have need of a personal physician, one who will attend me and my household, who will travel with me when I travel, who will serve the church with both healing and counsel. The position carries a substantial stipend, rooms within the palace, and the protection of the church. Are you willing?" I should have been honoured. It was a position many physicians aspired to, a mark of the highest professional achievement. But I hesitated. "Your Grace, I have a practice in the city. I attend many patients who depend on me, including the poor who have no other recourse." "The poor will always be with us," he said, not unkindly. "Other physicians can attend them. But I have need of you specifically. May I ask why, Your Grace?" He studied me for a long moment. "Because you have survived the plague twice and did not flee your duty. Because you tell the truth even when it is unwelcome. Because you understand that medicine is not merely the healing of bodies but the care of souls. I need a physician who will not flatter me, who will tell me when I am truly ill and when I am merely indulging in imagination, who will keep the confidences of the church and understand the weight of what he sees and hears." I understood then that he was offering me more than employment. He was offering me a place within the inner circles of power, where I would treat not only physical ailments but would become privy to the secrets of the church and the great families of the north. It was an honour. It was also a trap. But I was 40 years old, and I was tired of living in 2 rooms above a baker's shop. I was tired of worrying about my reputation with every patient, tired of the precarious life of an independent practitioner. The position offered security, comfort, and the chance to work at the highest levels of society. I accepted. For the next 15 years, I served as physician to 2 archbishops of York and their households. I lived in rooms furnished with carved oak and tapestries, ate at the archbishop's table, travelled with his retinue to London and Rome and Canterbury. I treated bishops and abbots, nobles and courtiers, visiting dignitaries and royal messengers. I had access to the finest medical texts in the archbishop's library, including rare Arabic manuscripts and Hebrew translations of ancient Greek works. I also learned things I wish I had never known. I learned that the church was as political as any royal court, full of intrigue and ambition and secret alliances. I learned that holy men could be as petty and vindictive as any commoner, that they jostled for position and whispered accusations against rivals, that they used confession and penance as weapons against enemies. I learned that great sins were often forgiven while small infractions were punished with exile or worse, depending on who had committed them and who had been offended. I learned to keep my mouth shut and my counsel private. I treated the archbishop for gout, for indigestion brought on by rich banquets, for headaches caused by too much wine and too little sleep. I treated visiting nobles for fevers and agues caught while travelling. I treated monks for the ailments of sedentary life, hemorrhoids, constipation, failing eyesight from reading in dim light. I treated nuns for melancholy and hysteria, conditions the church attributed to the wandering of the womb, but which I suspected arose from the crushing weight of enforced celibacy and cloistered existence. I also, on 3 occasions, was asked to examine women accused of witchcraft. The first was a midwife from a village near Selby, accused of causing the stillbirth of a lord's child through curses and evil arts. She was brought to the palace in chains, a terrified woman of perhaps 50 years, with grey hair and rough hands marked by a lifetime of hard work. The archbishop asked me to examine her for the marks of the devil, extra nipples, areas of insensate flesh, any sign of unnatural corruption. I examined her in the presence of 2 priests and found nothing remarkable. She was a normal woman, thin and worn from labour and fear. I reported this to the archbishop. "Are you certain?" he asked. "The lord who accuses her is powerful and insistent." "I am certain, your grace. There is nothing about this woman's body that suggests any contact with evil forces." He studied me carefully. "And if I were to tell you that political considerations require her to be found guilty?" I met his eyes. "Then your grace would need to find another physician to provide that finding. I will not bear false witness, not even for the church." There was a long silence. Then he nodded. "Very well. I will inform the Lord that the examination was inconclusive and recommend that the woman be released with a warning. You may go." The midwife was freed, but I had made an enemy of a powerful noble. The archbishop protected me, but I understood that my usefulness had limits. If I became more trouble than I was worth, protection would evaporate like morning mist. The second accusation was worse. A young woman, barely 20, had been found in the woods near York, speaking in unknown tongues and prophesying doom. Some said she was possessed by demons. Others said she was touched by God. The church needed to determine which. I examined her in her cell. She was wild-eyed and filthy, her hair matted, her clothes torn. When I approached, she shrank back against the wall and began to mutter in a language I did not recognize. I tried to speak to her gently, to calm her, but she would not be calmed. She rocked back and forth, hitting her head against the stone wall, and when I tried to stop her, she bit my hand hard enough to draw the heavy trace that only rain could cleanse. I reported to the archbishop that the woman was clearly mad, that her mind had broken from some trauma or imbalance of the humours, that she needed care and treatment, not punishment. I recommended she be placed in the care of a convent, where nuns could watch over her and pray for her recovery. "Madness or possession?" the archbishop asked. "Madness, your grace. I have seen possession, and this is not it. This is a human mind destroyed by suffering." She was sent to a convent, and I heard later that she died there within the year, having never recovered her reason. I do not know what broke her mind, what horror she had witnessed or endured. I know only that calling her mad rather than possessed probably saved her from being burned alive, and for that small mercy I was grateful. The third case I will not describe in detail. Sufficient to say that a woman was accused, that I examined her, that I found evidence of torture disguised as examination by others before me, and that I testified before an ecclesiastical court that her confession had been extracted through agony rather than given freely. The woman was released, but I made more enemies among those who had been zealous in their investigation. The archbishop warned me to be more careful. "You have a reputation for honesty," he said. "It is an admirable quality, but also a dangerous one. The church values obedience as much as truth." "I am a physician, your grace. I am sworn to do no harm." "And yet harm is sometimes necessary for the greater good. You would do well to remember that." I remembered it. I also continued to speak truth as I saw it, knowing that each time I did so, I risked losing everything. Would you have remained silent when silence meant condemning the innocent? Would you have lied when lying would have saved your position and your safety? I could not. And so I made enemies. By 1383, I had been the archbishop's physician for 15 years, and I was tired of court politics, tired of treating ailments brought on by luxury and idleness, tired of the weight of secrets I carried. I was 55 years old, and I wanted to return to something simpler, something closer to the work I had done in my youth. I asked the archbishop for permission to retire from his service and return to York to resume my private practice. He granted it, though not without regret, and he settled upon me a pension sufficient to live comfortably for the rest of my days. I returned to York and found new rooms, not above a baker's shop this time, but in a modest house with a garden where I could grow medicinal herbs. I hung out my sign again and waited to see if patients would remember me. They came. Not as many as before, for I was older now, and there were younger physicians in the city, men who had studied at the great universities of Padua and Montpellier, who spoke confidently of new discoveries and improved techniques. But enough came, and they were the patients I most wanted to treat. The poor, the desperate, those who had nowhere else to turn. I spent my final working years treating the afflictions of poverty, malnutrition, exhaustion, injuries from dangerous labour, diseases born of crowded and unsanitary conditions. I charged what they could afford, which was often nothing. I paid for medicines from my own purse. I sat beside beds in freezing garrets and held the hands of the dying when there was no one else to do so. I also began to write. I compiled everything I had learned in 40 years of practice, observations on symptoms and diseases, notes on which remedies seemed to help and which were useless, cautions against treatments that did more harm than good. I wrote about the importance of cleanliness in treating wounds, about the dangers of excessive bleeding, about the value of good food and rest over exotic compounds. I wrote about the limits of medical knowledge and the need for humility in the face of suffering. I wrote about the patients I had failed and what I might have done differently. I wrote about the moral burdens of the physician, the necessity of sometimes choosing between two evils, the weight of secrets, the loneliness of being blamed for what you could not prevent. I wrote it all down in a manuscript I titled The Physician's Burden, and I left it to the medical library at York Minster in the hope that someday someone might learn from my mistakes. In the year 1392, when I was 64 years old, a young physician came to see me. His name was William, and he had just completed his studies at Oxford. He had read some of my writings in the archbishop's library and wanted to discuss them. We talked for hours that first evening, and he returned many times over the following months. He was full of the confidence of youth, certain that the new learning from the Italian universities would soon solve all the mysteries of medicine. He spoke of anatomical studies conducted in secret, of careful dissections that revealed structures Galen had never described, of observations that contradicted the ancient authorities. The old ways are passing, he said. We are learning to trust what we see with our own eyes rather than what the books tell us. Soon we will understand the body completely, and medicine will become a true science. I smiled at his enthusiasm, though it was tinged with sadness. Perhaps you are right. I hope you are. But remember this. Every generation of physicians believes they have discovered the truth, and every generation is proven wrong by the next. What you learn today will be questioned tomorrow. The body is more complex than any of us imagine, and suffering is a mystery that cannot be solved by knowledge alone. Then what is the purpose of medicine? He asked. To bear witness, I said, to stand beside those who suffer and say, you are not alone, to ease pain when we can, to offer hope when it is warranted, to provide comfort when nothing else remains, to keep trying even when we fail, because the attempt itself has value, to be present in the darkest moments of human life, and to remain human ourselves. He looked at me for a long moment, and I saw in his eyes a glimpse of understanding, though I knew he would not truly comprehend until he had lived it himself. Will you teach me? He asked. And so, in my final years, I took on an apprentice, a young man who reminded me of myself at his age, earnest, idealistic, determined to heal the world. I taught him everything I knew, not just the recipes and techniques, but the harder lessons about doubt and failure, and the limits of human power. I took him with me when I visited patients, let him watch as I examined and diagnosed, explained my reasoning and my uncertainties. I told him about the woman whose child I had taken to save her life, and about the nightmares that still visited me decades later. I told him about the plague house and the hundreds who had died despite everything we tried. I told him about the accusations of witchcraft and the political intrigues of the archbishop's court. I told him about the farmer's son whose arm healed crooked, and about the beggar woman I could not cure but could only comfort. This is what it means to be a physician, I said. This burden of knowledge and ignorance, of success and failure, of being both honoured and feared. You will save some and lose many more. You will be praised when you do not deserve it, and blamed when you are blameless. You will carry secrets that weigh upon your soul. You will see things that will haunt you for the rest of your life. And you must do it all with compassion and humility, knowing that you are only human. I understand, he said. No, I replied gently. You do not. Not yet. But you will. I stopped practicing medicine in the year 1395, when my hands began to shake so badly that I could no longer trust them with a lancet or a needle. I was 67 years old, and I had been a physician for nearly 50 years. It was time to rest. I spent my final years in my garden, growing herbs and writing letters to other physicians, sharing observations and asking questions. I attended lectures at the cathedral school when my health permitted. I sat in the sun and watched the seasons turn and thought about all the lives I had touched for good or ill. I thought about Brother Anselm, who had taught me that we must try even when trying seems futile. I thought about the soldier whose leg I had taken and who had walked again on wood and leather. I thought about Sir Edmund, who had trusted me with his family's honour. I thought about the midwife I had saved from false accusation, and about the young woman whose broken mind I could not mend. I thought about all the nameless poor I had treated in crowded rooms and dark alleys, whose gratitude had been the purest reward I ever received. I thought about the children I had watched slip into their quietest sleep despite everything I tried, and about their mothers' faces, and about the guilt that never entirely faded. I thought about the times I had been right, and the times I had been catastrophically wrong, and about the terrible truth that I often could not tell the difference until it was too late. I thought about what it meant to spend a lifetime touching the boundary between existence and its ending, to hold that power and that responsibility, to be the one who stood in the gap and said, "I will try," and I wondered if I had done more good than harm. I will never know. That is the physician's final burden. We never truly know if our interventions helped or hindered, if the patient recovered because of our treatment or despite it, if we shortened lives in our attempts to lengthen them. We work in darkness, guided by imperfect knowledge, and hope that sometimes feels like prayer. But I know this. I tried. When others fled, I remained. When patients suffered, I sat beside them. When families grieved, I grieved with them. When no one else would touch the sick, I touched them. When the powerful demanded lies, I spoke truth, even when it cost me dearly. I was not a hero. I was not even particularly skilled by the standards of my profession. I was simply a man who had been trained to heal, and who spent his life attempting to do so, with whatever tools and knowledge were available. I failed more often than I succeeded. I caused harm in my attempts to help. I carried the weight of decisions that still trouble me in the depths of night, but I was there. In the darkest hours, in the places of greatest suffering, I was present, and perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that is all any physician can hope to be, a witness to suffering, a companion in darkness, a hand held when fear overwhelms, a voice saying, "You are not alone. I am here. I will not leave you." Now I am 81 years old, and my life draws toward its close. My hands shake constantly, my sight grows dim, my breathing labours with every step. I know the signs, for I have seen them in countless others. My time is coming, and I am not afraid. I have stood beside too many as they made their quiet departure to fear my own. William visits me often. He is an established physician now, with a growing practice and a reputation for skill and compassion. He tells me about his patients, asks my advice on difficult cases, and sometimes just sits with me in silence, keeping watch as I once kept watch over others. Yesterday he asked me what I wanted my legacy to be, what I wanted to be remembered for. I thought for a long time before answering. "I do not need to be remembered," I said finally. The work was its own purpose. If I have any legacy, let it be this: that I bore witness to suffering and did not look away, that I tried to ease pain even when I could not cure disease, that I told truth even when lies would have been easier, that I remained human in the face of inhuman suffering. That is a worthy legacy, he said. Perhaps, or perhaps I only tell myself that to make peace with all the times I failed. This morning I woke before dawn, as I have done for 60 years, and I went to my wash basin and cleaned my hands. The water was cold and my hands shook as I rubbed them together, washing away nothing, for they are already clean. But the ritual brings comfort. It is what I have always done, this washing of hands, this attempt to cleanse away the stains that cannot be seen but are always felt. The sun is rising now over the rooftops of York, and the city is waking to another day. Church bells toll the hour. A cart rattles past on the street below. Someone coughs in a nearby house. The sounds of human life, continuing as it always has, indifferent to the individual lives that rise and fall like waves upon a shore. I have been a physician in an age of darkness, when medicine was equal parts knowledge and prayer, when we understood almost nothing about the bodies we sought to heal, when every remedy was a guess and every cure a mystery. I've seen medicine evolve slowly, painfully through observation and error. I've seen the first stirrings of something new, a medicine based not on ancient authority, but on what could be seen and touched and tested. Perhaps William's generation will know more than mine did. Perhaps they will look back on our practices with pity or horror, wondering how we could have been so ignorant. Perhaps they will cure diseases we thought incurable, perform procedures we thought impossible, understand mysteries we never unravelled. I hope they will. I hope they will be wiser and more skillful than we were. But I also hope they will remember what we knew, even in our ignorance, that medicine is not merely about knowledge and technique, but about compassion and presence, that the physician's first duty is not to cure, but to care, that sometimes the greatest healing comes not from remedy or reckoning done by steady hands, but from simply being there, bearing witness, refusing to abandon those who suffer. That is what I tried to do. That is all I could do. And now my story is told, my burden laid down at last. The sun is fully risen, and the light streams through my window, and I am ready for whatever comes next. I have been a physician. I have borne witness to suffering and to grace, to the worst and best of human nature, to the fragility of flesh and the endurance of spirit. I have stood in the presence of the great mystery that separates being from unbeing, and I have touched it with trembling hands and carried its weight in my heart. It has been a dangerous life, this life of healing. Dangerous to the body, for I have exposed myself to contagion and exhaustion. Dangerous to the soul, for I have witnessed horrors that scar the spirit. Dangerous to reputation and security, for I have spoken truth when silence would have been safer. But it has also been a life of meaning, of purpose, of service to something greater than myself. I would not change it. I would make the same choice again, knowing everything I know now about what it would cost. For what else is life for, if not to stand in the gap between suffering and comfort, between ignorance and understanding, between despair and hope? What else are we here to do, if not to ease the burden of existence for those who share this brief and painful journey? I have washed my hands for the last time. The water runs clear. The sun is warm on my face, and I am at peace. This was my life. This was my burden. This was what it meant to be a physician in an age when physicians were as feared as they were needed, when medicine was as dangerous as the diseases it sought to cure, when healing was an act of faith as much as science. I bore it as well as I could. I pray it was enough.